Okay, perfect. So this is a topic that I've been excited to present. Was hoping for a little more attendance, but that's okay. We'll hope for a little bit more viewing online. But this is kind of an interesting topic to me, and something that I think hopefully you'll see why I think ties into health as we talk about it today. So that is really meditation and the exploration of consciousness and kind of mind-body connection, and a lot of things that people have sort of labeled as new age or woo, or maybe a kind of other type of alternative health or holistic health. And I would like to really put this into more of the mainstream of health. I think that is something that is one of my goals as a physician, and certainly with this talk. The other goal of mine really is this to be an kind of introduction to a group that I hope to start, which will be sort of a group centered around this exact theme of meditation, exploration of consciousness, mind, body, mind, other concepts like this. And really the theme of that, I hope, will be sort of bringing together everyone's diverse views on this topic and allowing them to share it in hopefully what I can create as a sort of safe space for that, and just an inquisitive place for all of us to share things that might help one another. So that's really the goal, and then to maybe also practice some of the different things that we may discuss there too. So those are kind of the two-pronged goals of my talk today. So not just to, give you guys some information, everyone who's watching as well as coming in, but then also then for this to be sort of the launching pad for what I hope to be sort of a regular meeting of a sort of socially engaged, curious kind of group. I always have a little disclaimer. So again, part of my disclaimer here is that this is definitely just for general information purposes. So you guys are being recorded, so you missed my little disclaimer there. So that's a disclaimer. This will be going on my YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be on there, you can just kind of remain silent. So otherwise, yes, so this is, again, general information purposes. This is a really complex, interesting, and sometimes emotionally charged topic, let's say. And so I'm really not here to step on any toes or to tell anyone that I know any more than they do. This is just my personal views and sort of some exploration of different information. And so again, with this topic especially, I would say, kind of an extra disclaimer there. And certainly I have no conflicts of interest. I'm not involved in any kind of, contractual way with anything we talk about here today. So the other kind of big thing here, that's all I can say for disclaimers. So some objectives here. So what are we going to try to talk about? So I said meditation, exploration of consciousness. So there's a lot of kind of fluffy concepts here and words that are a little bit hard to define. So I'll do my best to sort of define as well as I can what it is we're talking about, because some of this is in the realm of what some people call ineffable, which by definition means there's not words for it. So there you go. And I'm not necessarily great with words so I'll do my best. I do challenge a lot of the assumptions of kind of materialism, and that, maybe that physical reality is all that, there is to understand. So that's kind of a concept we'll talk about here. I'll explore some of the neurobiology with you guys. What do we know about sort of the physical details of what is going on here? So we will talk a bit about both of those sides of things. And I have a kind of a model that encompasses both of those things that we'll share here. Of course, I'm a doctor, so what is the connection to well-being and healing? That is, of course, central to some of my goals here as a doctor and someone who's involved in, what I believe should be involved in well-being and healing as a family medicine doctor. So, and then if everyone wants, we can do kind of maybe a short practice, and then maybe a little discussion. So I said meditation was kind of the first thing in my title, so we'll just address that one first. What is meditation? I think a lot of people talk about this being, well, I can't meditate. My mind is always racing. I think too much. I can't sit still. So that's, let me say that some of the common replies I get when I talk about maybe meditation, especially in a professional setting, perhaps as a tool for well-being. And I would say that that is a perfect place to start. Sounds like, you've already been meditating if you're noticing some of it. So I think first of all, just kind of pointing that out to people that, whether you're sort of sitting still and listening to your breath or not, there's a lot of different ways this looks in your life. And what this really is sort of using your awareness with intention, I would say, kind of that practice of focused awareness is different ways that people have described this over the years. So I think all of us who are, so let's say at least um, most of us that are fully developed and don't have some sort of, condition that's holding us back in a, neurobiological sense. And even maybe those individuals, we don't know what their experience is necessarily some of the time. Uh, I think have a sense of, okay, there's, we have certain feelings and then we have this other kind of part of, our psyche, our consciousness, again, our kind of spotlight of awareness or salience, right? So these are different ways to kind of talk about this type of thing that we're talking about to address, the some of the common rebuttals of the racing mind. That is sort of the nature of mind. This is what most people would talk about in this realm of why to, or what is, what's a big part of early meditation is actually noticing that racing mind, correct? And noticing that that is actually the nature of a certain aspect of human mind, of all human minds, is what I'm trying to say. And so just noticing that and then bringing that back, your attention back from, okay, well, Dr. Ramon's talking, but I'm actually thinking about, my dog. Did I leave them in or out today, or did I turn off the burner or whatever? And bringing that back. No, wait, I'm supposed to be. I did do all that, and I'm listening here. So that whole exercise, right, is what we're kind of talking about. And the analogy I made earlier in our group visit, and I'll make again here for this talk, is sort of that, if we're talking about exercise as a vehicle to strengthen your muscles, if we use sort of a pure physical kind of model, everybody understands that we have to do sort of repetitions of kind of heavy lifting or light lifting or whatever we're doing. You can't just, run 15 steps or, and then expect to run a mile later, and then, or, lift 5 pounds and then go into a competition, expect to lift 50, or you have to kind of work up to that or lower, so again, that's the skill kind of model is the same for this in meditation, and that bringing your attention back is that repetition, right? So the more that you do that, it actually, like, great, you did a lot of exercise, right? So people say, well, I sat and my mind raced, and I said, sounds like you had a good session, right? So noticing that wandering nature of mind actually is a huge part of meditation. And kind of the bigger, I think the second part of that then would be to not follow those thoughts, right? To see what maybe does bubble up when you don't allow those thoughts to kind of fully develop, and to, that you go chasing them with that attentional spotlight. If you don't do that, then what kind of comes up? I think this is sort of really scary for some people, for a variety of reasons. Kind of big umbrella one being something like trauma, and feeling uncomfortable in your bodily sensations for a variety of reasons. But that can also be true for many other reasons. This is kind of interoception. I'll kind of hit that bullet point real quick, what that word means in a sort of neuroscientific kind of fashion is the ability for your brain to kind of then sense all of your internal signals, right? So we have certain networks in the brain which are really tuned to this, that are always kind of have a lot of, let's say, input from our visceral organs, from our muscles, from all the different kind of tissues of our body. Our gut, right, has all these different specialized tissues that even have nutrient sensors and things like that. So we're discovering that our organs and tissues have all sorts of different information they're sending to the brain, even more than, let's say, previously thought. And then we have certain kind of networks in the brain that are responsible for sort of receiving that information and then transmitting it further. So we kind of call some of those networks interoception. One connection you can maybe make to what's happening here is that you're sort of getting in tune with some of those networks and sort of strengthening some of those networks. They talk about strengthening this mind-body connection. We'll get into some versions of therapy, let's say, that are called like somatic experiencing, which are based on kind of this concept too. So kind of again, you can see how that's sort of related to meditation. It's kind of aspect of it. Yes, when we feel our breath, right, that's one way to really feel a sensation of our body. Many prompts will talk about feeling your chest fall and rise. Where do you feel your breath? Do you feel it in your nose? Do you feel it in the back of your mouth, in the back of your throat? Right. So building that inner awareness and exploring those inner sensations. This is a big part of what meditation is. This is also, again, kind of the concept of mindfulness. I would say that's a little bit more about maybe putting this into kind of practice into your life. So yes, mindfulness is practiced sitting still and doing maybe what I just talked about. But then again, mindfulness is something I think that can be brought into all of the practices in your life, whether that's your career and daily interactions, whether that's your family life, whether that's, again, you just working kind of alone on something at home. So this can really be brought into any little task, whether it's, by yourself, social, again, it's all sorts of different settings. And what I'm talking about here is just being kind of inquisitive about, uh, what is it that you're kind of feeling, what you're saying, like where is that kind of coming from? There's also, so curiosity, right, is what I'm talking about. Another big concept of mindfulness would be non-judgment. That is so kind of an analogy might be, or kind of a model might be, if you were an alien, how would you kind of explore this, whatever it is that you're sort of, or if you were, let's say, trying to explain this to an alien, right, how would you explain to them sort of what you're feeling? Or if you were kind of looking at something as a beginner or as, like, say, through a child's eyes, right? So having that kind of curiosity and non-judgment, right? That it's not about, kind of this goal-directed behavior. We have to meet some sort of specific deadline, some specific kind of target. It's a little bit more open, playful kind of nature towards experience, let's say. So that is maybe some of the kind of different concepts of mindfulness and how that might be brought into your walk, or again, your daily conversations, or your chopping your vegetables and, stirring your stew, or whatever it is you're doing that day. Comments, questions? Okay. So then kind of if that was difficult, this is maybe even harder to try to explain. So consciousness, what is this? Well, I say that, but ultimately, I think we all experience this because this sort of is experience. This is sort of the flavor of life, the spice of life, the feeling of life, the feeling of being oneself. I think that's really at its core what we're talking about. So this attentional spotlight is probably one kind of aspect of consciousness, let's say, that we're talking about in meditation. And so consciousness is certainly something a little bit larger than that, in my opinion. But again, it is sort of this sense of being, this sense of aliveness, connection, wholeness, some people would say. I certainly would lean that way, or certainly endorse that. So again, there are kind of different, let's say, forms of consciousness. A lot of people would believe that that is, kind of how consciousness exists. So there are kind of embodied consciousnesses and maybe disembodied consciousnesses, and again, other kind of aspects of consciousness here that we'll explore. This is something that I'm very happy to see, universities and other kind of, academic models step up and kind of, do actual, study around and sort of try to legitimize this. So this is kind of, again, my effort to do that here today too. John Hopkins, many other places, with really good academic standing in lots of other ways, that are working in this field now too. Really, because I think, there's some extraordinary things happening, and things that are really hard to explain with our current scientific models. That's a little bit of sort of what it is. I think some other maybe aspects of consciousness might be the kind of ability to maybe feel empathy, or to sort of take in sort of environmental information and to internalize that and sort of kind of have a, let's say, not necessarily a reaction, but an intentional kind of plan through time, perhaps, is maybe one aspect of consciousness. By many of these definitions, you may sort of notice that perhaps humans might not be the only kind of life that might fit some of these definitions. I think there are many people that feel that way. There are many good reasons to feel that way. There are theories of consciousness that really go all the way down to that every single kind of particle and inanimate object contains some form of consciousness, which we'll kind of explore here too. So, can a rock feel empathy? I'm not really sure. Um, so this is kind of gets to that next bullet point of the hard problem of consciousness, right? That a lot of our even best scientific theories don't address where this kind of sensation or phenomenon comes from. You can see how difficult it is and how many different definitions there are of this. How many people kind of agree and disagree with, is human consciousness special versus, other maybe complex mammals, or not. So I don't have the answers to a lot of this, but again, this is just a sort of exploration of all of this kind of information and how this can perhaps play a positive role in our lives instead of being kind of a cloudy, confusing place, hopefully, is where we'll end up by the end of this. But that hard problem kind of goes to, we don't have so let's say as we get into some of the neurobiology, some ways that specific kind of neuroanatomy was learned was basically through neural lesions. So people get a stroke, or they get a injury and other things like this. And so then we would see that certain functions in their lives were completely destroyed. So a certain part of the brain is injured, really changes impulse control, right? This person used to be very kind of, gentleman, kind, courteous, etc. Now very impulsive, rude, again, etc. So again, so this is kind of the way a lot of things were discovered. Now we have all sorts of other fancy ways to then kind of test this without injuring the animal. And really what we've never discovered is quite, a single seat, let's say, of consciousness, right? So yes, we can make people unconscious. That happens, let's say medically all the time for things like surgery, for example. This happens very commonly with drugs that absolutely kind of destroy your ability to at least remember any kind of conscious experience for, can be for many times, very long periods of time that people kind of come out of. And we'll kind of talk about a little bit about that too. Uh, and even then, with these drugs that we say make you unconscious, people still come back with certain, experiences a lot of times, and have sort of different fragments of memories and experiences that they come back with that, sometimes do and sometimes don't represent, let's say, their physical experience. So again, there's all sorts of different problems here with the explanation of how this kind of feature of our lives and experience is generated, basically. So there is currently no pure physical explanation for this phenomenon, is basically what I'm saying here. Integral theories, so we'll get into this a little bit. So this is kind of some of the philosophical underpinning for, created by a man named Ken Wilber, philosophical underpinning for a model of reality that really says that consciousness is in kind of the base layer of reality, and that, all reality and consciousness are intertwined in a sort of, they're all one, really. And currently, there are some, in fact, even people from the, let's say, pure mathematical side of things coming to very similar conclusions like this, that to explain some of the strange phenomenon in the physical world and what we see with, let's say, some of these kind of particle collider physics and things of that nature. And then also some of the physics of, let's say, black holes and other kind of weird things in space and weird things here on Earth even. Basically, they've drawn the conclusion that perhaps reality is more of a mirror of some other type of something else that's deeper, that some people would, I've literally heard a mathematician say that, yes, it's like something like consciousness is the base layer of reality, and that, again, all of the physical world is sort of this hologram that's built on that. So there are some, again, kind of mathematical theories out there that even put kind of that as the possible kind of base layer of reality. So integral theory, we'll get into a little bit more here. This is kind of that philosophical underpinning for an idea like that. So there's this kind of 4 quadrants model. So for example, if we're talking about the previous slide, consciousness, our human consciousness, there is the, that experience, right? The upper left corner right now we're talking about is that singular experience, right? I am me. I've lived this life. I have these memories, and again, I have these experiences in this consciousness, and certainly in this present moment, you are experiencing whatever you're experiencing. Then that upper right corner would be, right, the brain, let's say, or your body and everything else that kind of generates, let's say, in theory, this whole entire experience, or is sort of defined in some ways by this experience, right? But so the objective is basically the physical kind of part of that, right? So the brain, the body, all the nerves, the connections, the muscles, etc. Then there's the kind of bottom left corner there, lower left corner, that gets into, again, kind of a little bit harder to explain concept, but this is that collective consciousness, basically. So, which we'll explore a little bit here, but kind of more that feeling of we, us. I think, again, most people at least understand, feeling some strong attachment to, let's say, your caregivers, your family members, your best friends, your somebody else like that. So we have, kind of this interconnected feeling with community, with maybe a larger cultural kind of circle, or, again, certain, let's say, value systems or other things like that. So those are the kinds of concepts and things that go in that we, right? They're not necessarily something in the physical world, but they certainly influence behavior, influence the world we create, and again, are, let's say, at least important concepts in kind of our lives. And then, of course, on the other side of that are like the kind of structures around that, right? So the things that kind of make those things happen, right? So okay, well, there's this many people in this location, so we're gonna make a zip code and put a post office and call that a city. um, and build some roads and other things like that, right? That's that interobjective. So we're gonna kind of connect these communities and do things like, and then perhaps in our brains, right, this might be like more like a social engagement network or something like that, which we know now is sort of an engagement system in our brain that has something to do with well-being, basically. So this is kind of that, again, Ken Wilber's attempt to have a theory that kind of describes everything at all levels, kind of reality. So I know this is a really kind of difficult thing. It's hard for me to understand kind of really also, but this is kind of my attempt to just expose all of us to this sort of idea and realize that, again, there are some maybe limits to a lot of other versions of, let's say, I'll explore specifically some of the assumptions we make in some of the other spheres of what we call kind of scientific even, that maybe don't capture some of the experiences we'll talk about. And so getting kind of right into that would really be a discussion around something like, and then if anyone online or anyone in person has any questions, please just speak up and interrupt. I'd be happy to take any kind of questions or interruptions. So transpersonal states, this is kind of, there's different terminology you can use, let's say, for different kind of altered states or kind of, I guess, different states of consciousness, where, these states aren't specifically with transpersonal or holotropic, I've heard is another good term, states of consciousness. What we're talking about here is a little bit more that it is not you kind of bound by this sensation of your own body and self and ego, etc., right? That this kind of can expand to something larger. So this can include things like near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences that have very, very common themes. So let me kind of step back for 1 second. So again, one of the objectives here was, I thought, for me to really say that, there's a importance and scientific way to go about this. And so here, I'm going to point out a whole bunch of things that are happening that I feel like, again, legitimize some of that work in my mind. So transpersonal states, we're talking about some near death, and because a lot of people think this is just like hippies doing some drugs and some other things like this, and it's really not that. That is only one very small piece of this picture. If we're going to be fair to what I think all share a lot of characteristics, basically, and it's not just me. Again, there's universities around this and all sorts of, many books and philosophers and other physicians and many other people talking about this. I'm just trying to give my take. So near-death and out-of-body experiences, right, share many themes. These are, again, kind of to define some of these near-death as literally people who are in, medically actually experiencing cardiac arrest. So would be, kind of maybe undergoing CPR or just down in their house or, out in the wilderness. Can be all sorts of, car crash, etc. All sorts of different ways, of course, that we can be near death. And then as these people are revived one way or another, that they come back with themes of things that are extremely similar, let's say, to kind of the rest of what I'm going to talk about here on this slide. One of those themes is indeed this kind of out of body experience, where basically you have this version of disembodied consciousness. So you still have the experience contains many sensory, let's say, pieces of information, colors, different writing on different things, the way certain machines were sort of operating in a certain way. People will come back with details like this that have now been verified in a, so certainly there are many stories that are either erroneous or unverifiable. However, uh, there are many also that have come back with absolutely verifiable and verified details that really seem to not be obtainable through any vehicle of how we know the physical kind of world to work or physical consciousness to work. So again, these are details like I just described, and these will be from both kind of physical locations near and remote, actually, at great distances sometimes from that person. So truly disembodied kind of experiences, flying through different aspects of space and other things like that. So that happens just in that first bullet point, to be clear. This is not, again, sort of, let's say, it is induced, obviously, by this terrible event, but not induced by anything else we talk about here. So the next point kind of talks about holotropic states. This is a term that was defined by Stanislav Grof, who is a psychologist, psychiatrist, and worked has, again, has a whole huge list of credentials, written many, many books, and created basically this version of breath work called holotropic breath work, and then sort of coined this term holotropic around basically the concept of towards wholeness. That's what those kind of two roots, holotropic, mean. Is whole, tropic, towards. So kind of states that are towards oneness, towards wholeness. And so these describe all of the kind of states we're talking about here. This is almost synonymous a little bit with transpersonal states, and is a term that he uses to kind of describe that. So other kind of things that fall into this category would certainly be what, other authors have coined terms like peak experiences. These can be, spontaneous spiritual experiences. These can happen in a variety of different ways that are certainly involved with religious, let's say, overtly religious practices, but also perhaps kind of spontaneous, kind of, let's say, some common themes there might be kind of serene, natural beauty, or even kind of physical, really extreme feats of physical climbing, running. We'll kind of get into that in some of the practices type thing. So not necessarily near death in the way that you're dying, but perhaps pushing your body to kind of physical extremes. People describe certain states like this of deep self-inquiry and then even transcendence from their self in certain ways during kind of those things, and that helping them through those, let's say, kind of what seems like impossible physical feats at times. So these things happen really in a variety of different ways, and again, share certain characteristics, which we've hit on a little bit, but let me kind of try to unify a little bit here. So kind of oneness, euphoria, a wholeness, basically that you're unbound right by this body and kind of singular self and experience. That is a very common theme among these experiences. People, I think, kind of come back and feel like there is more than this life, I guess, is sort of the best way I can put it plainly. That there is something past, let's say, this physical body, and that there are other planes of existence, at least. Again, you can argue, many people argue whether that's bound by this physical body or not, and whether that's only accessible when, as you have access to this physical body, let's say. That's, again, I'm not here to pick a side or another, but to just explain that these are some things that are worth explaining, or worth exploring rather. So then this gets into this collective consciousness kind of concept where people have experiences in these states also of experiencing kind of being the entire earth, being a cloud, being grains of sand, being all sorts of different aspects, large and small, let's say, of this reality, and then of this whole other world of realities that's been described for thousands of years, actually, right? So this is, I think, where a lot of people feel perhaps a lot of great kind of myth, art, literature, kind of the stories, great ancient stories, the Vedas, again, some of these sacred texts, many people think are sort of something that everybody can kind of access, and that information is just, perhaps each attempt to, well, one, maybe tools to access that information. That's what some of these kind of texts and other practices really kind of are, is how I'm going to frame it. And two, that what they're accessing is something like this, transpersonal collective consciousness state of reality, that, again, as I argued before, whether you look at this through kind of ancient spiritual practices or now modern kind of physics, let's say, really we're coming to that this is a plausible version of reality, that consciousness can be experienced outside of this physical kind of times space bound reality. So that was a whole lot. But again, kind of my attempt to legitimize this, and certainly to just talk about sort of some of the things that are as, let's say, real as maybe believing that just the physical is all that's here. I think, again, there's a lot of reasons not to believe that. I hope that I've at least shown that there are some reasons to doubt that, especially the kind of mechanistic, everything, again, quantum physics talks about, solid things aren't kind of even solid. We'll get into some other things about even just how our brain works and the experience of consciousness. So hopefully I've inserted some doubt into the just pure materialistic view. Application of scientific methods. So the philosophy of science can absolutely still be applied to these experiences. And I think that's clearly being done, and that's something I'm really happy to see. And I think we can all do this kind of in our lives, and sort of maybe even again with this group that I talked about at the beginning of the lecture, right? That takes sort of practice, repetition, right? And then sharing of results with other people. If consciousness, one way to really explore this is sort of as an individual, then we have to bring individuals together and, share our experiences, right? So this has to be, a lot of people talk about this not being necessarily scientific because you're talking about a subjective experience. But I don't think that's necessarily a legitimate argument against doing this, is really what I'm saying. It is the source, a lot of people, a lot of great scientists have said that practices like this were the source of their scientific discoveries, including kind of the structure of DNA is a famous story there. that is along those lines, Francis Crick. So again, I think that even though this seems implausible in lots of ways, lots of things, again, for us to have landed on the moon would have seemed very implausible to people 2,000 years ago. And again, so many different stories there, right? Of just because it's implausible or seems sort of unlikely doesn't mean that we shouldn't explore this, especially when so many people have such common experiences in such a diverse, let's say, kind of, array of kind of things in life. Just these experiences are induced in so many different settings, basically, is what I'm saying. And, of course, the last bullet point here, psychedelic states. So this is, again, one of those induction tools, right? So this is kind of, again, from plants and animals and other kind of fungi, et cetera, here on Earth, many of these that induce these kind of states. This is not necessarily a lecture on that, but again, these are, again, another body of states that too share many of these characteristics in many ways. Not all the time, again, certainly not all the time, but when done in a very specific manner, this has been shown now to basically replicate, what people kind of call the spiritual experience, in, let's say, upwards of 60 or 70% of individuals now. In sort of academic studies, we've shown that, a certain dose in a certain setting with certain kind of preparation really leads to something that people qualify as sort of this mystical experience, a spiritual experience. So again, that's where we have, again, started to apply perhaps some of these scientific methods to at least this one tool in this larger landscape of this space. Okay, so that was maybe a little bit more that upper left. We'll talk a little bit about the upper right here and the neurobiology to tie this back to the four quadrants a little bit. So, some interesting features of the neurobiology of consciousness, I start with that, are these sort of free will studies, if you would, in neuroscience, which discuss kind of, so the studies show, and there's a bunch of them that are done in sort of different ways that basically, so I'll describe one. They will have the person sit and kind of, they'll say, at your own free will, move your arm whenever you choose, okay? And just note the time. There's a timer here, right? Make sure you note the time when you make the decision to move your arm, and then you can move your arm whenever you want, okay? And so, and I think the experiment was done in a variety of ways, or move your arm right away, or wait and move your arm, some things like that. And then they were measuring certain brain signals to see sort of what happens in this decision tree when the conscious decision is tied to, let's say, some physical manifestations of that in the brain. And basically what they've found is that there is they've detected a half second, 500 millisecond delay from the time that the first motor complex is detected in the brain. So the first kind of movement, nerve signals that should fire, they fire up to a half second before people report their conscious decision to move their arm. And so this has, been extrapolated to sort of put, a nail in the coffin of free will and all sorts of other things. And that's not what I'm going to say here at all. But I would say that, this really reinforces that the physical space and kind of our experience have a bit of a gap. At least I think that it would be hard to, in my mind, I think that at least that is sort of a conclusion you can draw from the whole body of some of this work, not just this. But David Eagleman, a few other authors out there, if people are looking for someone to kind of dive a little bit deeper in some of this. And certainly there's some books about sort of more free will, like Robert Sapolsky's book, Determined. And so, but anyway, there's many other kind of things. They've done some mirror studies where they show if they kind of have a mirror where you're watching a mirror, and the mirror actually shows someone else's arm, and if that arm moves, people will actually then tell the people, I moved my arm, even though their arm was completely still, and they had no necessarily neural activity of movement either. Or actually, I'm not sure about the neural activity, but basically their conscious experience is that they definitely moved their arm, even though physically they didn't move their arm. So there are kind of a couple different kind of things like this where we've discovered that, again, kind of basically our conscious experience is in a lot of ways what, I've heard kind of a neuroscientist in this field called a controlled hallucination. So the brain has to take an immense amount of information, largely that is unconscious. Again, that internal organ information, information from your visual field. Evan looks interested today, or there's people yawning and sleeping here in the crowd, right? And these have these subconscious signals in my body that sort of tell me, okay, keep going, or maybe get off the stage. But we have all these different, let's say, kind of innate signals in our body that are, it's sometimes bubbling up into what's creating kind of thoughts, emotions, etc. Right? This is what neurobiology and neuroanatomy, neuroscience is kind of telling us now, right? That it is more of this bottom up, that, we have all these unconscious processes, kind of then pop up into conscious awareness in ways that, are much more that they kind of dictate that experience a little bit more than that we have this control over, hey, I'm hungry, so I can just will my stomach to stop sort of gurgling in this way, or I don't want to be hungry, right? It's just, again, we've all had experiences where that is overpowering, I think. The body sort of takes over whatever, your mind was sort of thinking. So anyway, so that's kind of what I'm talking about with this bottom-up processing model, that actually we are a lot more instinctual. There is a lot of information that our brain is digesting and then putting into our awareness in a way that, again, can be, let's say, misinterpreted, perhaps by the conscious mind in a lot of ways, right? It's sort of one of the things I'm saying here too. Yeah, so instincts is what I'm kind of getting at there, right? Instincts, most people would say, are not necessarily conscious. So these are those, innate drives. So, for example, if you've been on a hike, you sort of have, let's say, a big bird fly over you that's kind of low, right? And the shadow gets cast. Almost always there's going to be some eye turning, some crouching, maybe some facial expressions that change, perhaps even a noise that's made or breath that changes, the sort of scope of your vision changes, right? And none of that was in any way kind of really a conscious thought. Then you might sort of say to in your more kind of conscious experience, oh, like you might have something that might represent sort of this emotion of fear, right? But what we're discovering is that perhaps fear is a reaction, let's say, to that bodily, response, right? And as we get into some of the more practical side of kind of using this information, right, if we can arrest that there, or let that play out in a way that's more in tune with what this instinct is meant to do, right? So that's great, right? This bird flew over you, you crouched to sort of make sure you're protecting yourself, you tracked with your eyes, right? These are natural defenses, is what I'm saying. And if we don't let sort of our natural kind of processes play out, Peter Levine and a lot of other people would argue that this is sort of what kind of trauma is in our neural system. So getting into a little bit of that, again, that practical side, because a lot of this is about kind of treating inner anguish, or trauma of some form. And so that is, let's say, sort of some of the neurobiology here, right, of why maybe some what we'll talk about actually works. So that's that kind of instinct and unconscious processing, then emotion, right? That's sort of what I'm talking about here. And this can be in sort of those small, obvious ways, but then happens in sort of much more complex ways when you involve, let's say, a lifetime of, experiences, and then you're that person sitting right there in front of you, and then they do something that maybe they've done 1,000 times that you've had a conversation with about not doing, or what, again, you see how this gets wrapped into this, and then, those instincts bubble up in sort of ways that maybe aren't necessarily the most productive to you right there in that moment. And, but if we can arrest this at that sort of phase of, okay, reaction, then that's kind of, again, that's what mindfulness and meditation and consciousness and all of this is really about. At the end of the day, I would say, is to increase our well-being and health. And that's one, let's say, way in which that can happen. Natural DMT release. So this is kind of just that one of the theories around what explains some of the things that tie all of this together, from a neurobiological experience, perspective rather. So what does, I'll talk here a little bit about rhythmic drumming, dancing, these physical feats, psychedelics, near-death experiences, this rapid breathing. How are these all kind of leading to the same experience, right? So this might be kind of one proposed model of natural DMT release in the brain. Some people do believe that that's from the pineal gland. So I don't think this has been fully proven quite yet, but again, there's some really kind of theories and other things that really point to this as potentially what is going on. One of the other things that does have some more, let's say, at least kind of hard science around it, with experienced meditators and a few other kind of states like this, these holotropic, let's say, transpersonal kind of states, is that the default mode network, this network in the brain. So the brain, there's sort of these are kind of opposing networks in the brain, one of which is kind of referred more to the task-oriented or goal-oriented brain or network, and then the opposite of that would be more of this default mode network, or non-task oriented. So where does kind of your mind go when you're not necessarily engaged in planning, doing, executing tasks and being really goal directed. And this network basically also contains a lot of things like, so the medial prefrontal cortex, which is thought to be sort of a structure in the brain that also has a lot of sort of autobiographical information, the stories kind of about yourself, that you tell about yourself and things like this. So again, this has been, let's say, an area of interest in things like anxiety, depression, many other mental health conditions. And the kind of thing I tie that all together with is that a lot of those mental health conditions at the end of the day are sort of kind of, let's say, a story about yourself that isn't maybe the healthiest or the most true, even most of the time, almost all of the time. So it's kind of broken self story. I've sort of used that terminology. I don't necessarily love the term broken all the time because I don't think anyone's broken. But maybe just the story you're telling yourself could be changed a little bit, because you're not broken. So again, but that's part of that default mode network. And this network is decreased the activity here, at least by fMRI scans and some other kind of blood flow and other things like this, the activity here seems to be very decreased in, like I said, those subjects of expert meditators. And then I believe even in like acute psychedelic states, that's sort of what you see, is that ego kind of center goes down. Again, one of the features I didn't talk about, which I just brought up the word ego, is ego dissolution. That is one of, let's say, the features of these transpersonal or holotropic kind of states, right? Is that you're not bound by, I guess I did sort of talk about it, but I didn't use that specific word. So again, that might be one kind of biological way in which that's happening. So I've kind of alluded to this a bunch of different times, but I'll just dive into some of the specifics here. So that first bullet point on kind of science and materialism, are these things compatible? Can these things coexist? So again, I think I've explained that the way you are supposed to sort of apply the scientific method is really kind of within, let's say, kind of one field of, being, right? So you ask questions about a certain system or about a certain type of organism or about a certain field of sort of science, let's say, but then you don't necessarily take that and sort of take the things you learn from that and then assume that that's true in every other field. And I think that's what sort of happened in a way with kind of this materialistic physical view of, especially this old Newtonian view. So that happened for a period of basically 200 or 300 years and still has some, cast sort of a shadow, I think, on how people understand reality and what is sort of true here even in that physical scientific sense. And so what's happened again is that old view of Newtonian physics, right? What goes up must come down. This very robotic, mechanistic kind of view of reality that was the old physics, still in a lot of ways, I would argue, dominates the sort of philosophies of many things in many other fields. Meanwhile, we've gotten to a point even in their own field where the scientific method has now really said that, well, that doesn't show us the whole picture just on a pure physical sense even. So kind of 2 points here, right? One, that kind of most modern physics doesn't even support what it said before. Two, that you can't necessarily take that, assumption that physical reality is all that there is and then, kind of apply that to these consciousness experiences necessarily. Right? We have to sort of evaluate consciousness experiences compared to other consciousness experiences and explorations of consciousness. And that's what will lead to, let's say, better discovery in that particular field, right? So I'm not arguing that, that is necessarily the way to then make new, whatever, physical inventions. Some people might come to some insights, perhaps, but again, if we're going to talk about, exploring how to perhaps be more present and real in a way, true and authentic to yourself, I think that's one of the biggest points here of this, right, is that that's sort of what this is kind of about. Then we can't necessarily make some of these assumptions that I think sometimes we do. So that's kind of what this slide's about. Even the assumptions of the origins of life, right? So the Big Bang theory, let's say, which is the leading theory here, we still don't necessarily know where that singularity came from. So, and then again, I've shared here many scientific kind of views and mathematical views that really come to the conclusions. And again, I'm not here to get into the nuts and bolts of that. If you're mathematical enough to understand that, have at it, please. But Daniel Hoffman, I think is his name, is one of the people, at least in that field, that's come to these kind of consciousness as the base layer of reality type, explanations. There's a really good kind of exploration of some of this in Annika Harris. She does basically kind of an audiobook kind of called Lights On that has I think, a very nice, conversation around this topic, exploring this kind of on both sides with people more on more of the meditative side and say more on sort of the scientific side, and just exploring different views there. Um, so I am really here to say that I don't think these things are incompatible at all, and that, these things can and should kind of be friends and, even help each other. Um, and, so one other kind of distinction I'll make here is around maybe spiritualism and religion. I'm really not going to talk necessarily about religion, but sort of the one thing I'll say here is that, one big difference to me, at least, is that spiritualism is sort of about looking inside, and religion is sort of maybe what you kind of do more on the outside. And again, I'm not here to say that there's anything wrong with certainly the latter, and I really think the former, spiritualism, is actually required probably for health, which, again, then if we do that socially, then maybe religion is required for health too, perhaps, right, in some sort of form. Again, no particular thing, but I think that is sort of that social engagement, let's say, of many things seems to be a requirement for health, and sort of how our brain is built, let's say. And to tie it back again to maybe that 4 quadrants we're sort of talking about, again, that sort of I versus we component too. So that's how that sort of model kind of can encompass this in have a little bit more scientific, way to move forward and include this, let's say, in the way we develop certain things. So that's, let's say, like the California Institute of Integral Studies, right? They have a lot of work around this and sort of have a lot of integral theories that encompass that 4 quadrants kind of view, and then say, okay, well, if we apply this to, our social life, our political life, our financial life, our ecosystem, what does that look like? Instead of sort of being a little bit more just this physical experience, there's a subjective kind of part of all of that is what they look at. So that's some of the way that I think this is being used in a more, let's say, scientific kind of fashion. Okay, so that was a lot of background to maybe finally get to how are we going to sort of use all of this information to help ourselves or to help another in our lives to be, more present, to be more well, to whatever, to heal disease. So the first thing I'll kind of talk about, is this using this kind of bottom-up approach seems to be a really important way to release and kind of heal trauma, perhaps, right? So if we understand trauma to sort of now be a freeze or sort of stuck reaction that was sort of instinctually trying to play out in our body, that then got arrested, perhaps actually by our top kind of processing for our safety, let's say, in that particular situation. But now we're always stuck there. Now, any kind of bottom-up process that even comes close, let's say, to that, right, is going to trigger basically that same, all the things, right? It's going to put your top up, it's going to make that top brain think you're back in that moment, basically, right? And this is not really a choice you have necessarily, for some people, at certain points in their lives. So obvious examples of what I'm talking about is, soldier at war was shot at, right? Whatever, maybe had, comrades die in front of them. And now, 20 years later, they, hate 4th of July, for example, because of these loud popping noises, right? That, they know they're not physically, right? The top brain knows they're not in a trench. getting shot at, and that the fireworks, let's say, especially if they're not anywhere near them, right, have no real immediate danger to them at all. However, this is something that they would say they cannot control, right? Is sort of, again, just happens to them. And this, really, hopefully, I've explained some of the why that might happen, right, to us, to many people, right? And this has nothing to do with a choice, right, or the will of that person necessarily. However, if we really start to understand this, we can kind of break down this process and then get back into that present moment and realize, hey, okay, what I'm feeling is tense shoulders, and kind of my body posture has changed a certain way. So as we start to use that awareness to realize what our kind of body sensations are actually doing, there are versions of trauma therapy like somatic experiencing that I'm kind of talking about here a little bit, where then if you sort of allow that to kind of play out, people will actually kind of have, let's say, even some involuntary posturing or some other kind of reactions to this. And if you can kind of feel the feeling and then allow the top brain to actually still feel present safety, right, then you kind of reconnect this unpleasant body feeling with this top brain experience of present safety, right? It's kind of that rewiring that's we're trying to create here. And in that process, there are some things that kind of happen that seem to be kind of tied to what Peter Levine would say, or sort of tied to that, again, ancient kind of instinctual mammalian kind of brain of releasing this through kind of basically there's some shaking and some other autonomic nervous system kind of things that happen, temperature changes in the body, some, it is kind of a release, it does appear like kind of a release type thing when it happens in its most dramatic fashion. And again, has been described in thousands of cases to really be a way to heal deep-seated, symptoms for a long time, whether they're physical things like frozen shoulder, whether they're, just kind of psychological symptoms of anxiety, depression, crushing fear, kind of negativity, etc. That, all the way to, again, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, other kind of things like this, chronic fatigue syndrome, certainly things in that nature. Again, all sorts of specific and non-specific things that have been worked out, let's say, in this kind of way. So again, many people are writing about this. There's evidence, there's studies written about this. There's lots out there for everyone to explore there. So this is, again, hopefully I've demonstrated why this makes a lot of sense, that it really is a plausible way that is how we're sort of built, or how, is, let's say, it's in tune with kind of natural instincts and natural reflexes, in my opinion. The other kind of parts of like meditation, exploring consciousness, let's say we don't have a lot of trauma, or we're actually doing pretty well in our lives, and, things, again, there's a huge importance, I think, in health and sort of well-being about kind of purpose, story, having kind of this interconnectedness with the world around you. These are huge parts of well-being and really act as a huge buffer and prevention in a lot of ways. If we look at, let's say, some of the blue zones and some of the, again, people that sort of live really long, robust, healthy lives and are really vital and creative and energetic and involved through the kind of end of their life to older ages, the things that these people kind of share and are a sense of purpose and a sense of drive and a sense of connectedness, community, are really big themes that pop up in a lot of the centenarian, blue zone, etc. kind of research. So I really believe that there's something there. I think most of us that are kind of in that field of longevity in some way really understand the importance of mental health, of social health, right, of community, of having access to some of those kind of sunshine, good food, people that share some interest, of diversity of interests, even so. That's how this, I think, really can, tie into well-being. It really boosts well-being, even if you don't have, let's say, kind of negative things. The other thing here is that, movement and cognition are so tied together and extremely kind of intimately tied, right? So we're talking about exercise being one of the strongest tools for prevention of dementia, and things like this that I'm kind of talking about. And even in, let's say the kind of opposite, when we have a disease like, say, Parkinson's or other things like this that affect movement, right, that when we get them moving better, that their cognition gets better too, right, that those things kind of go hand in hand. So we have lots of examples of how, movement and cognition are very strongly tied together. So much of the brain is built around sort of that visual system and kind of orienting you in space and time. So that makes a lot of sense to me, at least. And so what I'm getting at here is that using that tool of interoception and understanding sort of the feeling of your body, how it feels to really move, right? So maybe working out, right, with really much more intention and consciousness of how exactly you're moving your body, right? These are kind of these mind-body techniques, right, that are described by expert bodybuilders, right, that say they gain more strength and have kind of bigger muscles using these kind of techniques, right? So this is not something necessarily coming from sort of that whatever woo new age community, right? These concepts came from basically, again, people that wanted just pure results, right? That's where some of these ideas first came from. And so what's happening here, right, is they're exercising mindfulness, and they're exercising those muscles of consciousness, right, to then actually change their physical shape, right, in this very direct way. So just illustrating again the power of kind of the tie between cognition and movement, and how many ways that this is sort of intimately tied. So this is why, again, we should become familiar with some of those maybe uncomfortable body sensations, right? And become more curious around them, and all of that, right? This is a huge part of kind of health and well-being. And again, maybe even related to that top point. Animal instincts, right? So I've again hit on here where we share so much with the animal world, right? That kind of bird example I gave, that's what, cats, dogs, deer, so many other animals would react in this way, right? So especially mammals, let's say. And so respecting some of those animal instincts of things like play, play is such a feature of mammalian development, of sort of this free kind of form, not the structured kind of environment of game with rules, and something that looks a little bit more unstructured. That's such a big part of how all mammals are supposed to develop. So again, going back to those animal instincts, our sensations are then kind of leading to, so this is sort of, again, some of Peter Levine's work. Sensations are leading to an image, and then, then really like what's happening, right, is our bodily sensations are creating our thoughts, sort of, is what I'm trying to say in a short way. And so putting too much value into those kind of that cognitive side, right, when maybe we're not fully in tune with that other instinctual side, I think is just imbalanced. Right? So I'm not trying to say that cognition doesn't have a role to play in our lives. Of course it does. There are many top-down approaches that really work well for people, and this is more like your traditional CBT and talk therapy and other reframing type things that are a very important part of many people's lives and important tools for all of us to sort of understand and learn in our lives as well. But what I'm saying is that if we don't have the other half of that and we don't sort of understand where some of our sensations are even coming from, then our brain is constantly going to try to come up with a story that may or may not be really tied to reality, right? And that's sort of when it is tied to reality, that is sort of what well-being is, right? Or let's say the present moment. Let me say that differently, kind of reality in the present moment. And then if it's not sort of tied to reality in the present moment, this maybe stuck here, stuck there, wherever, bouncing around, then that's sort of what disease really kind of is, at least on a mental standpoint. And maybe even, many people believe that maybe all physical disease sort of originates here too. So again, to kind of connect this back to a few previous slides, right? Again, if consciousness is integral to reality, then again, I think that actually has a sort of plausible line of thought to where disease does have kind of consciousness level origins. So something, again, just interesting to explore, and something that I think deserves at least the same level of resources, exploration, scrutiny that we give to so many other endeavors in our world today. Not to take away, again, from the importance of many of the things we're doing in the physical world and physical spaces, material spaces, etc. But again, just to emphasize maybe a little bit more importance and attention here, pun intended. Emotional regulation, and so again, I think it's pretty obvious how if emotions are sort of, again, I think a lot of experts here would say that emotions are actually sort of the reaction to the bodily sensations. Right, that the bodily sensations kind of happen first, and that the emotion sort of bubbles up after that. So there's a story sort of about William James, a famous psychologist type person that was exploring kind of how our emotions generated, and basically through kind of vehicles of meditation and kind of quiet inquiry. And he sort of used this analogy of, if you're running from the bear, you feel fear because of the running reaction. Basically, he was saying that the running happens first, and then you sort of feel the fear there, and almost kind of in reaction to the running in a way. So if we understand that emotions sort of are, let's say, reactive in a way, and we can become more aware of the initial reaction, now we can actually insert a pause and choose a reaction in a way, or choose, maybe to abort, or let's say it this way: you can't necessarily change the maybe emotion or sort of feeling state, but you can change, let's say, the behavior state, right? Because that's ultimately what we want to do. It's okay to feel fear, or to feel angry, or whatever, sadness, grief, etc. I would never say it's not okay to feel these things, right? But I think it's how those emotions then influence our behavior states that we're all sort of interested in. And what I'm talking about here is that this is sort of a model of how we can insert that pause in our lives. And I think what a lot of people practically say when they do meditate more, when they do some of these practices more, is that that's sort of what they see in their lives, right? That they're
Equanimity.
Sure, equanimity is, yeah, sure, great way to put it. Okay, so what are some of these things that we can start to explore? So simple meditation could be something like just breath-focused meditation, which would be just taking some deep breaths, or even just breathing normally and just basically watching your breath, right? This is something I described maybe a little bit earlier, but essentially kind of watching your breath and then watching kind of what happens in the mind as, and letting that sort of pass by, either like kind of clouds in the sky, or like leaves in a stream, or again, lots of different ways kind of people have put this over the centuries, to basically meaning don't attach to those thoughts with that, again, feature we were talking about, the salience, the spotlight, the awareness that you're trying to build, that muscle that we're exercising. Are we going to use that to really come back to the breath? Where in the body is the breath? Is it, how does your stomach, how does your chest rise and fall? What are you feeling in certain muscles? Maybe kind of, trying to relax things that are maybe tense. Again, this doesn't have to be sitting perfectly still in a position that is very uncomfortable to you, even on the ground, or it doesn't have to necessarily be with a particular kind of music or a particular kind of whatever. This can really look like, just sitting and kind of concentrating on your breath, whatever, in a subway, in a doctor's waiting, lounge or office, wherever, right? This can kind of happen for 30 seconds, for 5 minutes, at any time. A body scan is something similar, right? Just kind of going from head to toe, kind of feeling what it is you feel in that body. And then a lot of people will do something like a, squeeze and release kind of technique. So you kind of squeeze your face up and release, and squeeze your neck and shoulders up and release, and kind of do that throughout all of your body parts. Again, you're all welcome to try this as we kind of talk about some of this, as I'm sort of demonstrating some of this. So, and again, you kind of want to maybe even squeeze some muscles you haven't used before. If they're in your abdomen or in your pelvis, right? Try to find some maybe new muscles that you haven't used before, and then try to relax those muscles. You can explore where, again, maybe you hold some extra tension in that jaw or your neck or wherever, maybe in your stomach, maybe in your feet. So going all the way down to those, legs and toes. So that's kind of what that body scan is. Practiced awareness. This can, again, be more like that mindfulness throughout the day. Pouring your coffee, making your tea, again, things like that. Maybe having some gratitude even around perhaps some of this, right? And realizing some of the interconnectedness, these are kind of some of the things we can do with practiced awareness, and sort of even, again, with just daily tasks in our lives. Again, I think holotropic breathing, right? This gets into a bit more of kind of these powerful techniques where you do get into more of these holotropic states and have kind of these different experiences that we're talking about, kind of in these more one states, these whole states, quote unquote altered states, right? That maybe, in some arguments may represent more of reality than sort of what we can see in their current kind of ego bound, body bound kind of states. So that's certainly an argument to make there. And that these practices, again, I would use the term, I'd steal this from, again, Stanislav Grof, that a lot of these practices are actually kind of, quote, spiritual technologies, right, is sort of what they are, right? So we have technologies in the physical world, right? So we use radio waves to make the radio, and we use, spiritual technologies to sort of tune our spiritual receiver to kind of some of these other spiritual frequencies, perhaps, is one kind of analogy that you could make here. So a lot of these, again, I just think that's a nice term, and again, sort of puts that a little bit more in the framework of what maybe people talk about today, right? For many people, let's say, calling it a shamanic practice or ancient, practices, which is, again, where a lot of this comes from, maybe a bit of a, even a turnoff for them. So I'd say, again, this is a technology, right? This is a human technology that was developed thousands of years ago, and should still be a legitimate technology for all of us to use, is really what I'm saying here. And what are those technologies? right? So those are, again, those things like holotropic breathing, drumming, right? So this is, again, we see that drum circles can, again, just induce kind of mild states of well-being all the way up to, again, kind of these holotropic states. Dancing, twirling, right? These have been used in cultural and spiritual practices in many ways, for, again, well-being as well as kind of art. So it's not just necessarily kind of the art part of it. A lot of these people who are involved in these practices certainly would speak to this very strongly, that, again, that there is something kind of deeper, or quote, creative force or other thing like that kind of driving some of this, and getting in tune with that is sort of what puts them in the best sort of performance state too, right? So this might be also called kind of a state of flow, right? That a lot of people have described in all sorts of different facets, whether it's, let's say, like Alex Honnold climbing, in Yosemite or wherever else, free climbing, people marathon running, ultra marathon running, kind of, basketball players, all sorts of sports, type of physical feats, but certainly in kind of mental cognitive states too, right, of creative tasks, whether that be, again, sort of purely cognitive or also kind of mixed with other physical features, right? People describe these states of flow. And I think that's sort of another part of what is included here and what these kind of practices sort of can lean us towards, let's say. And so chanting, right? So this can be a variety of different kind of chants throughout. There are sort of some more Buddhist and Hindu and Vedic kind of chanting, and then there's sort of some Hawaiian chanting. There's many different cultures of kind of chanting, and different chants of different kinds. This can also look like mantras, and even just like positive self-talk and positive affirmations, right? So this doesn't have to be, something in a language you don't understand or something of that nature, right? This can look all sorts of different ways as far as, how to bring this into our lives. And then physical extremes, again, with some caution here, but again, a lot of people do use some tools here, in this realm to kind of understand their consciousness in different ways or to reach different states of consciousness. I've talked about many of the things here, but this can also be like temperature extremes. So like people who cold plunge or sort of alternate hot and cold contrast therapy, can lead to some things like this, or hot yoga. Again, there's some other things like that kind of push our bodies into these physical extremes of, temperature, of, again, all sorts of different kind of ways that can look in our lives. Perfect. And of course, there's many, many more here. And, again, as I kind of pitched earlier, right, hopefully, if not a part of today really, but as a part of kind of the group that hopefully can spur from this, we will be kind of exploring some of these practices, even doing some of these practices, at least briefly, within the setting of kind of, again, that curious exploration with one another. So again, this is certainly not an exhaustive list, and just hopefully the beginning of kind of where we can start, let's say. So some of my resources here, there's so many more than this, but again, these top 3 books are probably what really inspired this talk more directly, at least in time. And that was, again, kind of 2 physicians, Gabor Mate and Stanislav Grof, with The Myth of Normal and The Cosmic Game. And then certainly Peter Levine's book on kind of healing trauma and releasing trauma in an unspoken voice. And then Annika Harris, I've mentioned at least once during the talk, more with that audio kind of book. And she has so many different people on that, many different scientists, philosophers, etc. So many different kind of resources just within these resources, right? Each one of these reference, let's say, dozens, if not maybe hundreds of other kind of bodies of work. and again, in a variety of different fields. So hopefully this was useful to at least build kind of an understanding and to kind of, again, be an introduction for something that I hope will be, a fruitful thing for all of us to be involved in together. Great. That's all I got. And take any questions, comments. Anyone online has anything, we can take some questions or comments online as well. I don't know if I can hear them, but is the TV volume up? Do you know?
Thank you. I have a question about transcendental meditation.
Okay.
So I've never tried TM. Somebody was like, well, it's really hard to get an explanation of what that is, even if you ask people that actually do it.
Sure.
I think it's more the collective consciousness avenue, but I'd like you to take on that.
Well, so I can't say that I'm an expert on that particular form of meditation. But what I know about sort of transcendental or maybe kind of personal, meditation is, yes, that at a certain phase of kind of trying to focus on emptiness, that certain, of these, your consciousness will become unbound by your ego if you can focus on kind of stillness, for long enough, essentially, is the general concept. So that is something that takes an immense amount of time, essentially, right? Because you have to build that muscle that I was sort of talking about, enough to sort of have that kind of stillness, right? But that's, I think, the general concept there. And I would certainly take any input if anyone knows any more than that. So.
It's also like you're given a mantra from another person that has, or a teacher or whatever. And so I found something online here probably last year or so that explained how that is, I guess that mantra is come up with. And it's something to do with maybe like your birth year or maybe the year that you start or something. And then there's like these certain words that go for each individual thing. And that's how they come up with the mantra. Interesting.
True. Yeah.
But other than that, that's the only thing I've ever found what you're supposed to do with that. Yeah, and you can only get it in the future. And so
It's my understanding a little bit that I never do it. They do it a lot, like 5 hours a day sometimes.
Right. Right.
Online with a whole community across the world.
Gotcha.
Because I guess that collective consciousness is a thing.
I have certainly heard of many practices where, yes, doing it sort of together certainly enhances the practice. Again, whether they would be called specifically transcendental meditation or not, I can't necessarily speak to that, but I'm aware of a body of practices that are along that vein. Yeah. I think sometimes the labels can be in the way a bit, and that's why I really like this kind of concept of holotropic states, right? Because it's a little bit more all-encompassing. It's a little less important sort of the road, more sort of just that you have that experience, and that it can be obtained through a number of different kind of vehicles is sort of one of the big points I'm trying to make here. So. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that's what kind of was trying to be on to that because it was like it's so secret. Yeah, like you couldn't find it out and you had to pay a bunch of money to get your mantra. It's like, but it's not the same. To me, it should be free for all.
Yeah. 30.
I'm going to go ahead and at least stop the recording. We can keep talking, but I'm going to go ahead and stop that. Let's see here.